Welcome to this in-depth look at the Honda GX35, but this also applies to the 25 engine. In this video, I'm going to be addressing a few different topics. Mainly, is this engine any good for power equipment, and what it's like to use for power equipment. I'm also going to be looking at a few other things, though, such as, does this make a good bicycle engine or a small scooter engine? And, for you college students out there, does this make a good engine for a Shell Eco Marathon vehicle? And essentially what that is just a marathon for extreme fuel economy, that's all. So, I'm going to be addressing all of those things and just pointing out some miscellaneous things about this engine. So even if you don't have one, you might learn something here. So, let's begin. Now, the reason I have this engine is for power equipment, specifically for petrol strimmers or weed whackers for you North Americans out there. And I'm just going to say, even though this engine, yes, I'm aware that it's quite expensive. So the trimmer that I bought was about £335, I think. It may have been like $360 or something like that. It's been a while. And but I also have plenty of experience with two-strokes, especially with steels. I've had a Kiyang, which is actually a Korean. I'm just going to say, even though it is quite a bit more expensive, and even though it's more complicated, and it just, you say, hey, it's got a timing belt, it's got a cam belt, what's that about? And it's got valves, and it's got all this other four-stroke nonsense. Two-stroke, it's just piston and crankshaft, mix some fuel, and you're good to go. I understand that, but as somebody who actually has a farm and has to use this stuff, these are better, okay? These are better, and in terms of comparing them to other four-strokes, even though I have fairly limited experience, Ryobi is about the only thing I know, these are the best. And talking to other people who use these, they're the best. And I would highly go after one of these. If you can shell out the money for them, for this piece of equipment, for this engine, just do it. Because there is so much, and the reasons why is, first off, it's reliable. Okay, now I know in principle that it has more parts than the two-strokers, but the two-strokers are just a pain in the rear end, and I'm not joking. They're so temperamental, you know that. Anybody who has a two-stroke trimmer, they're probably going to have issues with all the time. And there's no mixing oil, although I like doing that. So I like mixing, making pre-mix and all of that. And I used to have an RX-7, and so I'd make pre-mix for that too. So, no, I understand, and I really do like the smell of the smoke. So, no, I'm not kidding myself here. But just for, being real here, this is the best. It is so much easier to use. If you just want your piece of equipment to work and you don't want to be yelling out expletives all of the time, and trying to throw your equipment on the ground, asking the gods why it doesn't start, you want this. It's more expensive, yes. It's more complicated, yes. It's more reliable, though. It is not that difficult to maintain, and the lifespan is phenomenal on these things. So, that's just my personal opinion. And at first I was very hesitant, thinking, okay, that's it's 230 quid for this engine, equivalent to about 335, 360, whatever it was, for the whole trimmer. That's a lot of money. But it's been worth it, okay? And as I said, somebody with a farm, I can tell you it's worth it. It is the best. Get one of these, and just don't worry about it. I can go on over and over about Ryobi using plastic camshafts. This is the wheel is plastic over here, but the cam itself is actually metal, which is what you want. You want the cam lobes to be metal, and everything in the Ryobi were plastic, so they melted. I don't know who thought that was a good idea, but anyway, that's the way it ended up being. So just go with the Honda. And there's many nice things, too, about this. It's just stuff that if you were the engineer, like the pull start, for example, the cog that catches the pull start is metal. On other four-strokes, they're plastic. So if you just happen to the wrong way, you can snap off the pull start and you're done. You're stuffed. You can't use it. So there's lots of little tiny touches on the Honda that are just very nice. And but just go with the Honda. It's just better. The lifespan on these things is fantastic. easily you can get 1,000 hours out of this thing. Now, I've heard of people using these things in bicycles for 20,000 miles, and they haven't had to pull it apart. They haven't had to split the cases on it. And that's phenomenal for a little tiny engine like this. And so 1,000 hours is easily doable on this, so long as, you keep fresh oil in it and everything. If you're wondering, as, you're using it for residential use, okay, I want to buy a trimmer and I just want it to work, and I'll use it once in a while, maybe twice or 3 times a week, maybe let the neighbors use it too. This thing will last 15 years. It's just they're built to last a lot longer than the other commercial, or not commercial, the other consumer junk. As I've said, so many of the parts in here that you want are metal, and the parts, especially like I said, the pull start, the cam lobes, everything, those are all metal. So that's what you want. In terms of maintenance, so yes, it's more complicated, but it's not bad. Okay, if you know anything about scooter valves, or even valves on, like let's say a lawnmower or something, it's no different. Okay, this is an overhead cam, and so you have these little followers. It's a weird design cam, and I'll go into that in a bit. But it's just like here's your tappet screw. See, so you got a tappet screw. You've got the set screw. You got the lock nut, and you can see the top of underneath there's the top of the valve. So that's it. And what's really nice is to do the valve adjustment. All you got to do is pull off this beautiful red cover, which is held in by one screw, and then you undo the rubber hose on the side, and then, which is literally pull, and it's off, and then 2 screws, the valve cover comes off, and then you have full access to the valves. It's so easy to do. I have a video, and even with me explaining all the things in the video, it takes, I think a video is only 28 minutes long. So it gives you an idea. It's so easy to do. It's once every 300 hours is what Honda recommends, and I just do it every year, and so easy. I promise you, once you get the hang of it, it's not going to bother you anymore. The cam belt, that's been an area of concern that people have asked me. I've never heard of issues with the cam belt, but then again, I don't know many people that have more than 1,000 documented hours on their engine, actually keeping track of how far, in this case, it was 20,000 miles. I'm talking to someone who used it on their bicycle. Obviously, if you're using it for work, you just kind of use it until it breaks, and then you get it fixed, and then you use it some more. You don't want to be bothered with all that accounting nonsense. But the cam belt, I've never heard of anybody actually complaining that they failed or anything like that. However, I think the belts are only 20 or 30 pounds, and they're very easy to fix. You will see my teardown video, and you can see how to replace the belt. It's so easy to do, but I don't even think that you will need to ever replace the belt, and that's why Honda calls it a lifetime belt, because the belt by its nature is going to last way longer than the rest of the engine. So it's nothing like a car belt where it will break. I have no idea if it's an interference engine, but if it breaks, it's probably been a really bloody long time that you were using the engine, and so I don't see this will ever be a problem for you in the future. Just my personal opinion on that one, and I've not had anybody tell me they've just needed a new belt. Usually it's the entire engine that grenades itself after being run into the ground or something like that. And oil changes are only 100 mils of oil, so that's 1 liter is 10 oil changes, literally. So 10 oil changes for a liter. Just you do the maths. I'm not even going to do it for you. And they're so easy to do. Oil change is like this. Undo the dipstick. You see, I'm going to do it in front of you. Well, I can't because there's no oil in this one. And then you pour it out like this. You dump it out. And then you fill it up until it starts dripping out. And then you put the stick back in. And that's it. That's the oil change. It literally takes, a minute? Maybe 2 minutes if you're being careful. So the maintenance on this is nil. And I think it beats the hell out of doing, changing, pre-mixing and all of that. And, is this the right premix? Did we get the 16-to-1 container, the 32-to-1, or is it the 50-to-1? Which one is it, And so it's just not that difficult at all. And as I said, 1 liter is 10 oil changes on this thing. So for maintenance-wise, it's so not a problem. Let me just put it that way. Okay, so as that's my case for the engine being for equipment, and yes, I highly recommend it in terms of the summary. Maintenance, no big deal. Lifespan is fantastic on them. The problem areas I have seen with these engines usually relate to the ignition system and not the carburetor, even though the first place people look is the carburetor because they tend to. What happens is the most common I've seen is that it will start and idle, but then you try and give it throttle, and then it sputters, and then it conks out. What that is as I've said, it's usually ignition related. So it could be one of two things. The magneto, I've never heard of problems with this one, unless junk gets inside and then hits the fins or something. But that's physical damage. Sparking plug is the main thing that usually goes on these, and they go for no reason to, and that's not really Honda's fault. There's a bunch of fake plugs out there, I've noticed. I got a dud plug to begin with, and so this is a new plug just because the one I replaced it with was no good. So I think that's not necessarily Honda's fault. I think it has to do with a lot of fake plugs out there, copycat plugs, and they're not very good. But if that doesn't solve it, you're bogging down issues on throttle, then it's probably your ignition coil. If you know how to set an air gap, that's all you need. And that's the same with two-strokers too. You got to set the air gap on there. You got to make sure that it's properly in. But the coil, I think, is 25 pounds. It's not that much, and the plug is 3-4, something like that. And for getting good parts, and that's usually the only thing I've really seen go wrong with these. When these things start to get on in age and they really start to wear out, yes, you do not have the ability to replace the cylinder. They do sell crankshafts and they do sell piston kits online. I don't see the point because it's just going to not be worth it at that point because you're going to have to tear apart the entire engine. You're going to clearance the cylinder, hoping that it's not out of round. And if it is out of round, then putting a new piston is not going to help. And if you re-ring it, well, how are you going to hone it? How are you going to break the glaze? It's not a good idea. Yes, you can try and salvage it, but if it was me, it's just a lot of work. I would just buy a new one. And I know I don't like throwing away things. I like salvaging things, but just trust me here. It is much better to buy a new one. Don't buy a used one of these because it's probably full of all kinds of parts just stuck in there to make it work. So buy a new one and be done with it, and I promise you, you will not regret it. It is a fantastic piece of engineering. It's a fantastic engine for what it does. Just go for the engine. Like I say, get a new one and use it into the ground, and then get another engine. Don't try and rebuild it unless you want to learn mechanics, and then it's a lot of fun. So, let's say you want to use this as a bicycle engine. Well, how good is it? Well, I'm going to be honest with you. My opinion, and I've ridden motorcycles since I was 11 years old, so I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but that's a long time. And it's not... I don't like it, no. I'm not going to tell you that I love it as a bicycle engine. For one, even though if you get the 35cc engine, it's just no torque whatsoever. And even though it's 35 cc's, an 80cc, I'm not joking, an 80cc two-stroke engine is way smaller than this one. Because, you've got the oil. Well, first off, you have all the cam and the cam belt, and then you have the oil reservoir over here. It's the 80cc engines are smaller. And so it's a big engine, relatively speaking, for how little power you get. Now, I've seen people do kits for these, and it's a very reliable engine, but in terms of usability, first off, the centrifugal clutch engages at 5,000-something RPMs. So it's very clunky, to say the least, when you use it. And by the way, this engine idles at 3,500 RPMs, all right? I have a 50cc scooter that idles at 1,200 RPMs, so it idles at 3 times the speed of my 50cc scooter, just to give you an idea, okay? So it's not a smooth, nice experience, in my opinion. Is it reliable? Yes, as mentioned, it is, if you skipped ahead to this part. And it is very easy to maintain, and it is very, very lightweight, as mentioned, even though it's kind of big. But weight-wise, it's not that much heavier than a two-stroker, because the engine's all aluminium. But, it's got no torque whatsoever. It's a very over-square engine. So you rev the nuts off of it. The clutch engages, like I said, over 5,000 RPMs. And then you get from 5,000 to around 7,000 is your power band, which is usually what the equipment always stays at, But it's not a very fun experience. And if you're using it to transfer yourself and a bicycle, that's a lot more than it was meant to take. Granted, it does it fine. I've seen people that take these things to 20, 25. I think the chap I was conversing with put on like 26,000 miles now. And that's what, almost 40,000 kilometers, or maybe slightly over. So it handles it, but it's not pleasant. Let me just put it that way. It's not as a bicycle engine, I don't like it. What I do recommend for a bicycle engine is the GHX or the GXH. I don't know GXH, I believe, 50. It's a Honda motor also. It's a vertical engine as well. But it has way more torque than this thing does. And it is, so it will be a much better riding experience. You can put on a much better clutch in terms of, you can utilize the torque, and it'll give you better fuel economy, and you can even rev it lower, and it will last longer too. And the GXH or the GHX or the XH, whichever 50, is a very, very good engine too. 1,000 hours easy to do on that engine as well. Kind of what you'd expect from a Honda small engine. So, but as a bicycle engine, no, I don't recommend it, mostly because it doesn't have a lot of torque. Okay, but what if you happen to be going to university and you want to, or what you are doing is you're trying to design a vehicle for the Eco Marathon, which is essentially the Extreme Miles Per Gallon Challenge. Okay, so what that is you're trying to design a vehicle that uses as little fuel as possible. Well, I know it's logical to choose this engine because it's so small and so light, and it's cheap. Yes, I know. But I will be the first to tell you this is a bad choice for the Shell Eco Marathon vehicles. In fact, pretty much any engine that works like this is going to be a bad choice, because there's and I know there's fuel injection systems too for these. I've looked into those, and they are extremely expensive and they're stupid, and there's no reason to, because I know it sounds nice to have an ECU that you can tune it and all of that, and you can have, you take oxygen sensor readings, and just don't do it. Okay, it's not worth it because of these two fatal flaws. The first fatal flaw is the power band. It's very, very high RPM power band, and it's a very narrow, it's wide for this engine, but it's narrow in terms of usable power. You got to remember, this thing only puts out 1 1/3 horsepower in its top spec. 1 1/3 horsepower is not a lot of power at all. My 50cc scooter has 5 horsepower, okay? So this thing is 4 times less powerful, roughly speaking, than my 50cc scooter. So this engine has no power whatsoever, and it's not going to be a very good thing for a 4-wheeled vehicle. Even worse, though, is the thing that you can't really adjust, or you can't adjust the power band with cam timing. So if you're thinking about cylinder filling, which you're probably not, but if you're thinking about cylinder filling and you say, hey, why don't we adjust the cam timing? You can't do it because it's got a single lobe right here. You see, here's the cam, and there's no shaft. It's not a cam shaft. It's just a cam. In the literal sense, and it only has a lobe. It's only got one lobe, so there is no adjusting the cam timing with this. You can't adjust the intake and the exhaust for an Atkinson cycle effect or anything like that, because there's only one lobe controlling both intake and exhaust valves. So if you had an overhead cam with 2 lobes, that would be possible, but you can't do it with this engine, so you're stuck with the power band that it has, which is, 5,000 to 7,000 RPMs. That's a lot of RPMs, that's a lot of friction, and that is not good for efficiency. It's very bad for cylinder filling, which is why it has a low BSFC, a brake-specific fuel consumption, or actually it's high, meaning I think it's 360 is what it is on this engine, which is kind of bad when you look at something like a Yanmar L70 will have a brake-specific fuel consumption of 170. Yes, that low. So to generate a certain amount of power, the Yanmar diesel, yes, I know the diesel has a lot more, diesel is just more efficient in general because of its high compression ratios, but the Yanmar is twice as fuel efficient as this. Now, I don't mean that this will use double the fuel in the same amount of time, but for example, if this was producing 1 horsepower and it took 1 unit of fuel, the Yanmar engine would take less than half of that same fuel to generate that same amount of power. So that gives you an idea. So this is a very inefficient engine, believe it or not. Even though it takes forever to consume that tank like this, the efficiency of this engine in terms of, in fact, the numbers you probably are familiar with is the percent of fuel that gets converted into motion. And this engine is something like 17% efficient in terms of turning fuel into movement. And so it's not good, let me put it that way. I think it's 17, and on a good day it's 20. You know, if you are keeping it in its power band, it's around 22% efficient. And the reason, and one of the reasons, is because it's a big over square engine as well. Even if you did all that adjusting and all the cam timing nonsense and having fun with your fuel injection system that costs twice as much as this engine in the first place, you would have less than half of a horsepower to play with. You can see where this is going. I'm not going to go into any more detail in this because I think you can get the idea. This is just not a good engine to even start with. But for a go-kart, though, this is great. So if you want to make a go-kart for a little kid, 1 horsepower is phenomenal. It is such a good number for a kid. So if you want to fabricate yourself a little go-kart or something for your kid, a 1 horsepower, no transmission go-kart powered by one of these is a superb go-kart. So I just wanted to say that these 5 horsepower go-karts are way too powerful, in my opinion, for these young kids. I have a 5 horsepower scooter, and that thing will do 45 miles per hour easy. So I say this is a great thing for a go-kart or a really, really small scooter for someone to learn on. But in terms of you people wanting to do an eco-marathon vehicle, let me just say, don't do it. It's not a good engine for the eco-marathon. And that's it for the basic information of this engine. I hope this was... I'm sorry, I'm just talking, you know, and I just have it sitting here. It's because I'm doing a video on tearing it down. So if you want to see what it's made of and how to tear it apart and put it back together, please look at the other videos that I've created for this engine. If you want to maintain the engine, I have, or you're doing the maintenance yourself, I've done the valve adjustment video, and I've also done a carburetor rebuild video, and I have many other videos on repairing scooter engines as well, so if you want to check that out, go ahead. But anyway, I hope you learned something. I hope I answered your questions. I'm Mini Motorman, and so until next time, goodbye.